Right, you can hear that. I've switched the microphone on. That always helps. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. This is the fifth session of this particular kind of seminar, the Earth as a Freudian Spaceship, and this is the beginning of the second half of this particular course. So the first half consisted of an introduction to the general project and then 3 sessions on what I referred to as our teachers. So that was Fanon, Freud, Deleuze and Guattari. And then there was a break. The other seminar participants met together and they had a conversation and they came up with some really good questions. I think they talked about a bit themselves, and I'm hoping to talk some more about them with maybe tonight. So that was really cool. And so this session marks the beginning of the kind of second half. And here, so the course is organised just to remind people of getting involved, or if they're coming, at a later point. The course is organised around a series of texts, some of them from our teachers, and one of them called Breath, which is the first part of a book that is kind of coming out of this project that me and Erica Harper are working on. And the second half of the course, whilst we're going to continue looking through that book, that particular text, Breath, the second half is beginning to kind of look at stuff that we then do next, the other bits of the book, as it were. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try and tie up or not tie up or give a framing for that kind of second dynamic, and in particular this sort of second dynamic of the text. So if the first is breath, the second 2 parts at the moment are sketched out as being called body and earth, and these second 2 parts begin by developing a concept that we can call the threefold. And they begin by trying to develop this in some sense as a response to what takes place in the first part of the text. Okay, I hope everyone's good and enjoying the weather. It's been a bit miserable, but warm at times, which is always good. It's been great for the allotment. Things have been growing like mad. I had to really, work hard to keep the weeds and the grass down. Anyway, let's get going. So I want to recap a little the talk of the abstract machine that I was giving in session 4 when we talked about Deleuze and Guattari. So don't panic. The philosopher has a way of making us panic when they mention abstraction. The abstract often feels like some kind of strange test, a weirdness, something out of the everyday. And there is something strange in the very act of philosophy that is closely connected to abstraction, to the capacity to abstract. But don't panic. Anyway, let's just recap a little. So the abstract machine is the name given to the nuclei of an enunciative assemblage. An enunciative assemblage is a name given to a particular space of expression. And the enunciative assemblage is the production of a context, if you like. We encounter an enunciative assemblage each time we encounter a context. And what these concepts are doing, therefore, what these concepts, abstract machine and enunciative assemblage, what these concepts are doing, therefore, is giving us the machinery of production. They can enable us to take something that we understand and use in everyday practice, a concept like context, and enable us to begin to think about exactly what's involved in a context, how it develops, how it is constituted. And they enable us to give dynamism to our thinking of context, that we are not trapped in the end result and can instead begin to think about how a particular situation comes about. Whoa, that was creaky. Apologies. Now, Marx talked about the importance of such a process, not being trapped in an end result. It's a key part of his methodology. And one of the ways he put it was to say that we cannot tell from the taste of the wheat how it was produced. In other words, we cannot tell from the experience of something how that experience came about. Now, if we stop with the experience, if we stick with it, then the tendency is to become passive in the face of what we might call the given. And the experience is taken to be something like a fact, a given. And how we are given a particular fact is lost. It's forgotten. And this is one of the differences between something like schizoanalysis and phenomenology, for example. In phenomenology, we take the experience, the given, as it is, and explore it, examine it, trying to track the forms of that experience. What we don't usually do, I say usually because there are some key tensions in phenomenology around this point, but what we don't usually do in phenomenology is focus on the genesis of the experience, on how it came about. Now, the other element of the concept of the enunciative assemblage is that it's not derived from meaning processes. It's not about what we mean. And often our encounter with the concept of context is one in which meanings are framed by their context. Remember the idea mentioned in an earlier session about the strategy of escaping language. This is another key feature, this strategy of not getting trapped in language. So this is a big part of why we might want to talk of enunciation rather than meaning. Still, it has strange connotations in English, this word enunciation. It reminds me of being told to speak properly, or of issues with accents and speech differences. And there's a normativity, in other words, a kind of moral order attached to the idea of enunciation that I don't think is totally appropriate, nor is it a big feature of the way in which Guattari uses the concept. So this seems like it might be a connotation that derives from translation. What's more important is that enunciation refers to the way in which an expression connects what we might call a sender and a recipient. It's an act, not a meaning in that sense. So the enunciative assemblage is more than just context, it's also the dynamics of relation, the way in which the expression is operating. An example, central to our project, the phrase, "I can't breathe." Let's call this a particle or element of expression. It's expressed in a variety of contexts, but the form of any context in which it is expressed is one of suffocation. It becomes, in that sense, something like a refrain of suffocation, or perhaps more precisely, a refrain of the form of suffocation. It becomes a refrain as it spreads, as it becomes echoed, as it develops something like a life of its own, and as it becomes a refrain, as it becomes something in the air, it begins to produce a form of consistency, and at that point, it begins to operate as an abstract machine, bringing disparate moments of life together in a consistency that suggests a wider process. Now, trying to encounter that process is pretty much what we began with when we started with that phrase in this project, when we started with that phrase, "I can't breathe." In trying to encounter and think this form of suffocation, expressed in the elementary expressive particle encountered in the refrain, "I can't breathe," the specific form is crucial, but more importantly, that which isn't quite so specifiable, but which surrounds it, is what's difficult to think. So the attempt is to think about the production of consistency. It involves some kind of gamble, a speculative moment. Maybe the best way of understanding this is to ask about which context matters when we encounter a situation of the world. It's clear, for example, that Eric Garner's death takes place within the context of white supremacy, in particular how this has developed in the institutions of authority and control within the United States. The history of policing in the US, tied up as it was with the control of slaves and then with the maintenance of racial segregation, is plainly the central immediate political context of Eric Garner's death. It remains the context of further ongoing deaths, including that of George Floyd more recently. So to begin from that incident and then go somewhere else other than policing is perhaps odd. It's what we do, but it is perhaps odd. In doing so, we don't want to deny that context of policing at all. However, what we wanted to do, and what we're trying to do in the project, was feel a connection that was offered in that phrase, that refrain of "I can't breathe." That connection was with a form of suffocation, a form expressed in Eric Garner's killing, but that doesn't stop there, nor begin there. So this was the gamble in many ways, to connect the form of suffocation found at this moment with the ongoing climate crisis that we faced, and behind that with the sense of suffocation that might be sensed as part of a more general dynamic. In particular, the form of suffocation is not natural, we might say. It rather involves the imposition of force, what we refer to in the text as the chokehold, an imposition of force that has been naturalised, which has come to seem normal. Now, Fanon is famously quoted as saying that when we revolt, it is because we cannot breathe. This is Fanon himself. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we cannot breathe. This is something that Fanon says. Now, as the refrain of "I cannot breathe" spread, it was clear in so many ways that there was a resonance with air pollution, with the climate crisis, but also with being overwhelmed, a sense of drowning, or rather, and this is the crucial difference, with being drowned deliberately. This is what we could sometimes call the deliberate disaster. And here we can begin to shift the tone in which the refrain might be heard. If I fall off a boat, I cannot swim, and then I drown, it is of course clear that I cannot breathe. Yet this is quite distinct from if I am pushed off the boat, and different again from a situation in which someone or something is holding my head underwater, and it's this last sense that we feel is vital. This situation we're in is not an accident, a natural disaster. Rather, it's a deliberate disaster, but one in which there is no simple subject doing the deliberation. Rather, and confusingly, there is something like a natural process taking place, which is forcing our heads underwater, but this natural process isn't natural. So just as we are often called upon by Marxists to recognise the way in which capitalism presents as a natural process, and as such called upon to resist it in some small measure by trying to denaturalise it as a form of political economy, so too the civilisational process in which we are currently being drowned is not a natural process. There has been an attempt to recognise that process by ascribing it to Enlightenment thought, or to instrumental reason, or to some other kind of thinking process, but such attempts rest on the idea that it's a way of thinking that's at fault. This seems to be only a very small part of the story. It's undoubtedly true that a way of thinking develops from the Enlightenment that codifies a particular image of the human, of reason, and of that which is to be expelled or denied. And this way of thinking is also part of the background to Fanon's attempt to think a different human, a thinking that's radically developed by Sylvia Wynter in quite wonderful ways. Yet the emphasis on ways of thinking can too easily let ways of life slip away. Trying to retain multiple different dynamics as they weave together, reinforce or resist each other, and together constitute the braided reality of the earth, this is what we want to do through the strategy of retching, bringing together in our thinking both the wretched of the earth, to use Fanon's phrase, and the wretched earth. So this refrain, "I cannot breathe," is taken as an abstract machine, the nuclei of an enunciative assemblage that we call the earth. In it, we strategically connect incidents of institutional racist violence with a process of deliberate disaster encountered in the climate crisis. And in doing so, we try to learn lessons from the struggle against an anthropomorphic mode of thinking, to feel our way into some sense of the contemporary processes, the flows of desire, to use a schizoanalytic phrase. And here we find Fanon and schizoanalysis combined to offer a series of vital lessons. Give me a second. So Fanon and schizoanalysis, we think, combine to offer a series of vital lessons. Now, Fanon brings to the fore the experience of territory under colonisation, both physically and psychologically, or more accurately, both materially and existentially. Schizoanalysis brings to the fore the processes of production and, perhaps most importantly, of anti-production. Resistances, frictions, dynamics that reverse and repress. These are the kind of things that we're involved in anti-production. Now, both Fanon and schizoanalysis both share a relationship to capitalism as, in some sense, the basic name of the process that dominates the flows of desire across the earth. So, and at the heart of all of this, as a kind of bad uncle, lies Freud and the dynamics of repression. Dynamics that are immanent to the flows of desire rather than imposed from outside. And that's kind of crucial, to be immanent to the flows of desire. When I use the word immanent, I mean kind of coming from within. Okay, not imminent as in about to arrive. Two different kind of things. Immanent in philosophy is distinct from transcendent, distinct from something outside. It's something from within. And so at the heart of this, as I say, Freud brings this kind of notion of repression, in which the dynamics underpinning repression are immanent to within the flows of desire rather than imposed from outside. The fascist within. That's the phrase that Deleuze and Guattari use in schizoanalysis to kind of point to this particular immanent process of repression. So colonization and decolonization, flows of desiring production and anti-production, and an immanent dynamic of repression. These are all crucial elements of what we're thinking and how we think, and of how a lot of other people are thinking at the moment. And we bring these moments of conceptual production together around the refrain, I cannot breathe. And we do this in order to try and reorganize the consistency that surrounds this expression. This is in many ways what the breath text is trying to do. It's an attempt to encounter the consistency of the earth as we live it in this time, at this moment, in this place. This place we call home, where we find ourselves so often homeless. This place of the play, of the familiar and the strange. The first responses to this thinking were mixed, and perhaps rightly so. The mode of expression of that first text brings with it its own limitations. It's playfully building on the use of dates from a thousand plateaus, it's avoiding academic interpretation in favour of declaration, and it's trying to take sides in what seems clearly to be a conflict, avoiding any sense of a neutral, universal thought. Crucially, however, it is angry, upset, and expressive of that, and as such, it's one moment in a longer dialogue. After the deluge, we might say, comes something else. And I'm just going to take a moment there, and a couple of minutes, and I'm going to put a little bit of music on, so just take a sort of moment, and then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the threefold. This next moment, after the deluge, after the anger, after the breath text. So just grab yourself a coffee, or stretch your arms and legs, think about where you're sitting and how you're sitting, and just relax for a moment. Right. Let's go back. Now I'm playing music here from the thing called Soundtrack by Twitch, but they still flag it, and it's meant to be completely copyright free, no DCMA sort of flags or anything like that. Still comes up as a flag sometimes. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, for this session, one of the things I gave some of the seminar participants was a bit of reading. You can find this on this page of mine, and it's this particular bit of reading that I gave them, and some of them have had a look at that. So this is kind of part of the background of some of what I'm talking about here, and there's an image of the water and the ocean there as well that might be of interest. So what was I saying? Yeah, after the deluge, that first text breath is a kind of deluge. It's an attempt to listen. It's an attempt to sort of articulate an abstract machine, and it's an attempt to kind of reconfigure the consistency around it. The kind of things that are kind of connected into that, and what you can hear, what in a sense is allowed to speak through that assemblage. So I want to turn now to this thing that we're calling the threefold. So another moment appears. After attempting to articulate a consistency, what Guattari would perhaps have called an ethico-aesthetic sense, the next moment is to move and to think through that consistency, not to simply stop with it facing us down like a tidal wave about to crash. So from within this initial breath text, we found our conversations of how to move kept coming back to this figure of the threefold set of relations that we call the one-to-one, the group, and the community. There are only a few moments in the breath text that indicate this development, so it might appear at first like a jump, a leap, but it's consistent with the ethico-aesthetic consistency that developed, in particular the rejection of interpretation and the aim to mobilize desires, affects, senses and sensations. This aim to mobilise desire is an attempt to respond to the ways in which our desires are already mobilised, constantly, and yet in a way that often only adds to our sense of suffocation. The world offers us a constant stream of inductions to anger, a dynamic that is increased as social media spreads. No doubt because anger offers engagement and activates the desires, engages the click that the machine tracks. The data tracking machines need an index of desire, an index or marker that can be registered or tracked, so the like button develops, the share button, and a whole variety of ways to register clicks, these momentary engagements of desire with the representation that's offered to us in the form of the world. There's nothing more anathema to the data tracking machine than indifference, and yet indifference can only offer a momentary respite. Precisely because there is in the flows of capitalism an incapacity to leave us alone. It cannot allow escape. It cannot allow another world to develop that it lets alone. Not because of any moral dislike, but because capital is driven by the flow to transform everything into a commodity, to make everything subject to exchange value. To paraphrase the old proverb, capitalism puts a price on everything and knows the value of nothing, and that everything and nothing there are not metaphorical. It's an overwhelming process, which is in a large measure why the dominant affect that it engenders increasingly becomes one of suffocation. Now, this framework offers us a way to begin to diagram the braided flows of desire that we try to bring into consistency around that refrain of I cannot breathe. The flows of desire of colonization and decolonization, production and anti-production, and imminent self-generated repression. Again, as an abstract machine, there is a kind of refrain, in this case, the one-to-one, the group, and the community, a triplicity, a threefold. These threes keep reappearing. Perhaps this is the sorcerer's effect, or the psychoanalysts, or maybe even some curious effect of adding Fanon into the set of names so that it's no longer Deleuze and Guattari, but now Fanon and Deleuze and Guattari and. The connections come through the writing, the thinking comes through the conversations and the writing, not before. So whilst we write, it also writes. Whilst we talk, it also talks. This earth, this life we are not the privileged source of expression, and in fact the more the earth speaks, the closer perhaps to the sense of being able to hear something. In every conversation, in every attempt to think, in every attempt to write or express, there must be these momentary phrases, these particles of expression that are emitted not by a mind or a person, but by an enunciative assemblage itself. So the threefold thus comes into play, offering us a way to move. And when I say us, I'm talking about me and Eric. I'm not talking about everyone else in the world. All we can do is, in a sense, offer our conversation and our thinking for something that might generate further conversation. So the threefold comes into play, offering us a way to move. It develops from a thought about Fanon, about the different elements of his expression, the different modes or moments in his texts. The angry revolutionary, the furious man encountering the racist colonialist, but also the lover, the sensual partner, the one whose skin is alive to the touch, and also the thinker, the philosopher, and also the doctor, the scientist, the psychiatrist, aware of their complicity, encountering their complicity as part of an institutional failure of care that they have to resign from. So the threefold begins with thinking about these moments that are first encountered in this doubling of experience expressed in the book Black Skin, White Masks. The doubled mode of existence that had already been noted by W.E.B. Du Bois in his work on the doubled consciousness of the black experience in the United States, the experience of an internal conflict within the colonized. So the first moment of the one-to-one is found in Fanon's discussions of love, in the move from mask to skin, in those relations of the expanded capacity in which this one enables that one. This is the experience of love. The mode of relation here is encountered in psychotherapy, mobilized and reorganized perhaps, but it's also encountered in sorcery, in devotional or dedicative work in particular. And in the revolutionary, this moment of the one-to-one is perhaps most encountered in the counter-revolutionary, in the moments in which the enemy is no longer human. This we call the movement from mask to skin, from role or image or representation to intimacy, connection, affection. And then comes the group, the movement we called the movement from skin to mask. That role in the group, the way we're seen, but more crucially perhaps the collective body, well beyond the human, the pack, the swarm, the gang, the moment of what's been called strategic identity sometimes. And then the third moment, the community, the place where these two dynamics weave together to produce demographics, ecologies, and what are sometimes called in Deleuze and Guattari and in schizoanalysis, molarities. So each of these moments is something like a form of relation. One-to-one, group, community. They're each like a specific form of relation. And together they are a generalized diagram of such forms of relation, constituting something like a model of the world. Obviously there's huge hubris there. Don't worry too much about that. We're allowed a little bit of hubris every now and then. But that model of the world, cartography maybe to use Guattari's phrase, is not aimed at accurately representing anything. It's rather aimed at preventing forgetfulness. It's not that this threefold model is, as it were, the way the world is. Okay, that's not any suggestion there that this is the way the world is. Rather, if in each moment of analysis we remember these three modes of relation, at least, then our senses of the world are multiplied by thinking in each of these modes. And then perhaps we can learn to remember the earth. So I want to talk now about something that I'm going to call the rewired world and the specific problem of capitalism. So at one point in the breath text, in section 8 to be precise, we declare that the revolution is as simple and complex as this: new ways of organising one-to-one group and community relationships and the ways of connecting overlap, producing unforeseen assemblages. Now this is not a prescription for a future, or rather it is a prescription, but one that arises from a description. In other words, this is a way of understanding what has happened to the world, so as to understand how another world can develop. To use an awful phrase that abounds in some social or political theory, this is a theory of change, of how change takes place, change that we might describe as revolutionary. For it must be remembered that capitalism was a revolutionary change. The revolution took place and we live in its aftermath now. It was, of course, not the revolution of the wretched of the earth or the wretched earth. It was the revolution of the modes of relation that occurred as a particular process took hold. Now that process mobilized and colonized flows of desire, it gradually producing transformation in the modes of relation of the earth. It rewired the Freudian spaceship, which is comprised of these modes of relation, these various flows of desire. Think of the advent of capitalism as a kind of recombination, a rewriting, a reorganization. A viral epidemic, and one that has now spread throughout the body, slowly creeping up the limbs until it begins to fill the airways and the mouth and the lungs, and we begin to choke, producing the expressions of resistance we hear each time we encounter that refrain, "I cannot breathe." Now for Guattari, this rewiring occurs through a process of identity that is distinct from and which subordinates a process he calls singularization. He suggests that, to quote him, identity is what causes singularity to pass from ways of existing to a single identifiable frame of reference. He goes on to offer a description of what he means by singularization, and I'll put that quote in the text in the chat here. Just give us a sec. So this is Guattari's description of a process of singularization. This is given in a book called Molecular Revolution in Brazil, on page 94 if you're particularly interested. And this is Guattari. What I call processes of singularization, simply being able to live or to survive in a particular place at a particular time and to be ourselves, has nothing to do with identity. Things such as, my name is Felix Guattari and I am here. It has to do with the way in which, in principle, all the elements that constitute the ego function and are articulated. In other words, with how we feel, how we breathe, how we want to speak or don't want to, being here or going away. So the distinction between identity and singularity rests on this way of organising our relation to the world within either a single frame of reference or multiple elements of constitution. The single frame of reference, the uniform, control, has its roots far deeper than in capitalism. The state, the monotheistic God, the platonic good, all these express this singular frame of reference. And the attempt to impose it is the rewiring of the singularities of life into one great big consistency. On the one hand, this process can be seen as material control. When William the Conqueror colonises this land, he imposes control through those huge Norman castles and his militarised nobility, but also fundamentally through marking a single frame of reference for productivity, the Doomsday Book, in which each productive singularity across the land is literally listed in a single identifiable frame of reference. On the other hand, this process is existential. It's marking us as members of a single nation state with a single head, the one that wears the crown. Again, a single identifiable frame of reference. So the process of identity rewriting singularity is not a process confined to capitalism. If anything, it's a description of a more general dynamic of the human socius, or more specifically of what Guattari called the productions of subjectivity. Yet what must be remembered is that these processes only take place as territories overlap and press on each other. There is no singular space of the world, or rather there is no necessarily singular space of the world. There have been and will be many worlds, even if there is still only one planet. So as the Normans impose their world on the Anglo-Saxons, they do so through spatial domination, through the occupation and dominance of territory. The territories overlap and conflict, and one response, one solution to the territorial conflict is to impose a single identifiable frame of reference. The difficulty is that in this image we can see the territory, we can mark the space, we can understand this movement of imposition, control and change. Now this is a difficulty because it's too easy, too visual, too representational. It's too easy to think of this as the way in which rewiring of the socius takes place, as the way in which change from one mode of relation to another occurs. It's archaic, and it speaks to a previous earth, one in which that earth was a limit to the human. in which it dominated us, but as a background, in the way the weather dominates us as a background, as a rhythm of production and existence. The Earth then still contained many worlds. One territory might be a site of conflict and domination between different worlds, but the Earth itself sat and breathed in and out as the rhythms of the planetary movement ran throughout the year. Now, what occurs with the advent of capitalism is something more generalized. Rather than territorial conflict, rather than conflictual territorialization, we begin to see radical deterritorialization. This is the claim of schizoanalysis. The rewiring begins not as territories overlap, but as new territories are integrated into a new logic, a new value system, one that is not tied to any specific territory, but rips up all ways of doing things, those singularizations, and it begins to mark them all under a new single identifiable frame of reference. Capitalist value production refers to no head of government, no crown or dictator, no community or place. It refers only to itself, in a self-reinforcing dynamic that produces a new kind of territory, an abstract territory, one that lays over all of the earth, no longer limited by the seasons, as it has no temporal rhythms. Every day is just another day. And yet the earth is still underneath this, still the great source of productive forces and desires, still the great rhythm. Guattari's conflictual dynamic between identity and singularity is focused on the way in which subjectivities are produced, human subjectivities. And yet the singularization identity tension is also an interesting way to think about the tension between the earth and capitalism. The earth is the great singularization process, capital the great identity process, and as the monoculture of capital reached global densities, the earth began to be slowly choked. And we live now in the time of the last breath, as we call it in that breath text. Now, it's the abstract nature of this process that's vital to grasp if we are able to break the chokehold. It's for this reason that something like a concept of abstract machines is useful. It forces us to try to grasp the particular peculiar process that is capitalism. If we can begin to encounter the earth as a singularization, we might begin to be able to hear it. More importantly, we might begin to be able to begin the process of cultivating singularization beyond the human. It is, moreover, as part of a process of cultivating singularization that we think about the threefold modes of relation. Remember that description Guattari gives of singularization, being able to live or survive in a particular place, at a particular time, and be ourselves. Now, he's focused very much on the human here, but the need for the earth to live, to survive in a particular place, at a particular time, even to, in some sense, be itself, as it were, is a condition of the production of subjectivities. Now, the way in which the threefold could operate here is to take the earth in all its elements, all the flora, fauna and ecosystemic structure, as comprised just as much of the various modes of relation as the human socius. Indeed, to reconfigure the socius as necessarily including all these non-human elements. Now, it might seem we've come a long way from Eric Garner's Killing to talk about rethinking our relation to the earth. It may be too far. The connections may be tenuous, or just perhaps it might be that a way to develop the ethico-aesthetic frame we need is given in this way. The ethico-aesthetic frame, a way of feeling that the rewiring that we want to take place, a way of feeling that that rewiring will need to have in order to take place, in order to develop the cultivation of singularization. Now, this way of feeling is, in some sense, like rewiring our intuitions, reorganizing our instincts, if you like, so that those basic, intuitive, unthinking habits of living can escape capital's capture of our drives. And this is the general idea, I think, that we're trying to develop with this idea of the threefold. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about all that in the next couple of sessions and go into more detail about that, but that hopefully can give you a kind of framing of how it began to develop. I'm kind of reporting, in a sense, as I mentioned, on this research project. So this is a kind of reporting, and it obviously from my perspective, of what we were doing and how we got to a certain position and why we began to develop certain ideas or certain ways of expressing things. I'm just going to go through some questions that the seminar participants developed, and briefly respond to them, and I hopefully might talk to them a bit more about that later. And so I'm just going to sort of talk about them in public because they're part of the public kind of discussion here as well. I think they don't mind. I'm pretty sure they won't mind me mentioning these. So okay, so as I said, I'm going to just respond in the same way that you would if you were doing a talk or something, you know. In other words, not necessarily not having written a response to some of the questions that seminar participants have brought up and have sort of produced, and I'm sure if I'm very lucky, they might continue to do this. And it's a really useful thing to do. So the first one is someone asked about the idea of owning the earth, and suggested that this idea repeats a bit through the first parts of that text breath in the Freudian Spaceship, and they were interested in that. And it's an interesting kind of dynamic in some sense, this idea of ownership, because it points in some ways immediately to this idea of property, and this is one of the phrases or one of the kind of ideas, concepts central to political theory. You know, private property, public property, the use of property, the role of property, and even in Marxist concepts of capitalism, the concept of property, as well as anarchist concepts, the concept of property is very, very central, and it's one of the things that is, in some sense, I think, a bit of a mistake. It's true, and it's not false, but it's only part of a picture. And so sometimes I like to think of owning as much better understood in that much more colloquial phrase where someone's owned you. You know, they've owned you in a game, or they've owned you in particular with the kind of a joke or a put down or a particular phrase, you know, and you find yourself owned. In other words, you find yourself kind of caught in another logic, caught in someone else's kind of setting of the terms of the game. And that, I think, is much closer to what I think of, or I would like to articulate as owning. Pwned by capital, yes, exactly. So, and I think this is a closer way to think of the way in which capitalism begins to take ownership of the earth. Obviously, there is no person there who can say this piece of property is mine, but there's a kind of logic that begins to capture everything else that goes on, and as it were, the expression of private property ownership is an expression, it's an end result, it's the wheat, as it were, that we mentioned before. And so if we just taste that property relationship and don't begin to look at the production of that relationship, that kind of pwning by capitalism, then we don't really kind of completely grasp things. And I think this speaks to one of the problems that occurred in the response that the revolutionary movement had to the Russian Revolution and various other of what were called the socialist states, because they often determined their disputes around whether they should support it or not by basing their analysis on whether it was a workers' state of some kind. Often they use phrases like deformed or degenerated. So the Soviet Union was a degenerated workers' state because it was slowly taken over by the bureaucracy, whereas someone like Czechoslovakia was a deformed workers' state because it was set up in a particular kind of way that wasn't quite right. This was the kind of analysis that came out, for example, from Trotskyists. Now, the problem with all of that was it led them into these absurd kind of structures of trying to defend something, because they could see that, in a sense, the capitalists didn't own, in the same way that they did inside a capitalist state, the property and the relations of production. So they were kind of like, well, who else could own it? It must be the workers. But what they didn't seem to deal with was, in the sense that the logic of capital was not fully rejected in those systems, and still, in a sense, began to capture them back and pull them back in. And this speaks to something that's sometimes called value theory, the developments in Marxism, which I'm very interested in. I think there's a lot of interest in. So that kind of relationship of being owned by a set of values, almost, I think, is much closer to the way I would think of as ownership. So there's another question, a bit on how Fanon and Guattari can intersect. What is Fanonian schizanalysis? How would it look? What's a concrete example? Okay, so here, one of the crucial things is that we try and use this notion of Fanonian as an adjective. So, if you talk about a beautiful car or a beautiful sunset, you're kind of giving that event, let's say the sunset, a particular tone. Instead of it being an ugly one, it's a beautiful one. So the adjective is kind of giving it a particular colour wash, a particular tone. And I think that's how I think of the combining the intersection of Fanon with schizoanalysis. It's trying to sort of essentially give a new tone to schizoanalysis, one that is, fully kind of fully kind of resonant with the way in which Fanon wrote. Now, that's obviously this is not meant to try and, in some sense, like minimise some of the key differences that there would be. Fanon has a much stronger relationship to existentialism, has a much stronger relationship, in some senses, to Hegel as well, within his work. One that, in some senses, is in conflict with Deleuze and Guattari. Although it should be remembered that Deleuze and Guattari also have a very strong background relationship to Sartre. In particular, the way in which Sartre, who they call at one point, I think Deleuze at one point calls him his master, but they have a particularly strong relationship, I think, to Sartre in the way in which Sartre moves from a very, let's call it, bourgeois form of existentialism to a continuous engagement with Marxism in order to develop a much more complicated and a much more interesting notion of groups and individuals, something that comes out in the critique of, in a book called The Critique, or the volumes Critique of Dialectical Reason, which are Sartre's kind of later work, 60s work. And so I think the relationship between Fanon and Guattari, I think the Fanon and schizoanalysis, I think not only is it the adjective to schizoanalysis, to trying to give a different tone to schizoanalysis, there's also this kind of intersection around some of the background issues that originate in the development of Sartre's philosophical work.